God's mercy on Israel. Romans chapter 11, verse 1 through 24. I ask then, has God rejected his own people, the nation of Israel? Of course not. I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, and a member of the tribe of Benjamin. No, God has not rejected his own people, whom he chose from the very beginning. Do you realize what the scriptures say about this? Elijah the prophet complained to God about the people of Israel and said, Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. And do you remember God's reply? He said, No, I have 7,000 others who have never bowed down to Baal. It is the same today for a few of the people of Israel have remained faithful because of God's grace, his undeserved kindness in choosing them. And since it is through God's kindness, then it is not by their good works. For in that case, God's grace would not be what it really is, free and undeserved. So this is the situation. Most of the people of Israel have not found the favor of God they are looking for so earnestly. A few have, the ones God has chosen, but the hearts of the rest were hardened. As the scriptures say, God has put them into a deep sleep. To this day he has shut their eyes so they do not see, and closed their ears so they do not hear. Likewise, David said, Let their bountiful table become a snare, a trap that makes them think all is well. Let their blessings cause them to stumble, and let them get what they deserve. Let their eyes go blind so they cannot see, and let their backs be bent forever. Did God's people stumble and fall beyond recovery? Of course not. They were disobedient, so God made salvation available to the Gentiles. But he wanted his own people to become jealous and claim it for themselves. Now, if the Gentiles were enriched because the people of Israel turned down God's offer of salvation, think how much greater a blessing the world will share when they finally accept it. I am saying all this especially for you Gentiles. God has appointed me as the apostle to the Gentiles. I stress this, for I want to somehow make the people of Israel jealous of what you Gentiles have, so I might save some of them. For since their rejection meant that God offered salvation to the rest of the world, their acceptance will be even more wonderful. It will be life for those who were dead. And since Abraham and the other patriarchs were holy, their descendants will also be holy. Just as the entire batch of dough is holy because the portion given as an offering is holy. For if the roots of the tree are holy, the branches will be too. But some of these branches from Abraham's tree, some of the people of Israel, have been broken off. And you Gentiles, who were branches from a wild olive tree, have been grafted in. So now you also receive the blessing God has promised, Abraham and his children, sharing in the rich nourishment from the root of God's special olive tree. But you must not brag about being grafted in to replace the branches that were broken off. You are just a branch, not the root. Well, you might say, those branches were broken off to make room for me. Yes, but remember, those branches were broken off because they didn't believe in Christ, and you are there because you do believe. So don't think highly of yourself, but fear what could happen. For if God did not spare the original branches, he won't spare you either. Notice how God is both kind and severe. He is severe toward those who disobeyed, but kind to you if you continue to trust in his kindness. But if you stop trusting, you will also be cut off. And if the people of Israel turn from their unbelief, they will be grafted in again, for God has the power to graft them back into the tree. You, by nature, were a branch cut from a wild olive tree. So if God was willing to do something contrary to nature by grafting you into his cultivated tree, he will be far more eager to graft the original branches back into the tree where they belong. In this chapter, Paul points out that not all Jews have rejected God's message of salvation. There are still a faithful few. Paul himself, after all, was a Jew, and so were Jesus' disciples and nearly all of the early Christian missionaries. God chose the Jews, his own people, to be the people through whom the rest of the world could find salvation. But this did not mean the entire Jewish nation would be saved. Only those who were faithful to God were considered true Jews. We are saved through faith in Christ, not because we are part of a nation, religion, or family. On whom or on what are you depending for salvation? Do you think it's easier for God to love you when you are good? Do you secretly suspect that God chose you because you deserved it? Do you think some people's behavior is so bad that God couldn't possibly save them? If you ever think this way, you don't entirely understand that salvation is by grace, a free gift. It cannot be earned, in whole or in part. It can only be accepted with thankfulness and praise. The hearts of the rest were hardened. Was God's punishment for their sin? It was confirmation of their own stubbornness. In judging them, God removed their ability to see and hear, and to turn from sin. Thus, they would experience the consequences of their rebellion. Resisting God is like saying to him, "Leave me alone." But because God is always and everywhere present, his answer to that prayer might be to agree and make that person less sensitive, more hardened to him. The very possibility of that happening ought to keep us asking God specifically for ears that really hear and eyes that really see, openness and responsiveness to him. These verses describe the punishment for unresponsive hearts predicted by the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 6, verse 9 through 13. If people refuse to hear God's good news, they eventually will be unable to understand it. Paul saw this happening in the Jewish congregations he visited on his missionary journeys. Verse 8 is based on Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 4, and Isaiah chapter 29, verse 10. Verses 9 and 10 are from Psalm chapter 69, verse 22 and 23. Paul had a vision of a church where all Jewish and Gentile believers would be united in their love for God and in obedience to Christ. While respecting God's law, this ideal church would look to Christ alone for salvation. A person's ethnic background and social status would be irrelevant. See Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. What mattered would be his or her faith in Christ. But Paul's vision had not yet been realized. For the most part, Jewish people have rejected the good news. They have depended on their heritage for salvation, and they do not have the heart of obedience that was so important to the Old Testament prophets and to Paul. Once Gentiles became dominant in many of the Christian churches, they began rejecting Jews and even persecuting them. Unfortunately, this practice has recurred through the centuries. True Christians should not persecute others. Both Gentiles and Jews have done so much to damage the cause of Christ, whom they claim to serve, that Paul's vision often seems impossible to fulfill. Yet God chose the Jews, just as he chose the Gentiles, and he is still working to unite all believers so they become a holy temple where God lives by his Spirit. See Ephesians chapter 2, verse 11 through 22. Paul was appointed as an apostle to the Gentiles. He reminded his Jewish brothers and sisters of this fact, hoping they too would want to be saved. The Jews rejected God's offer, and thus Gentiles were being offered salvation. But when a Jew comes to Christ, there is a great rejoicing, as if a dead person has come back to life. Speaking to Gentile Christians, Paul warns them not to feel superior because some Jews were rejected. Abraham's faith is like the root of a productive tree, and the Jewish people are the tree's natural branches. Because of faithfulness, some of the Jews have been broken off, and Gentile believers who were branches from a wild olive tree have been grafted in. Both Jews and Gentiles share the tree's nourishment based on faith in God. Neither can rest on heritage or culture for salvation. Continue to trust in his kindness refers to steadfast perseverance in faith. Steadfastness is proof of the reality of faith and a byproduct of salvation, not a means to it.